Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be talking about a very special Catholic figure today, a man who we might call an excommunicated saint. At least there's a cause for his canonization. We're going to talk about Jerome or Girolamo Savonarola, a famous Dominican or infamous, depending on who you ask. And we've got a chap here who's going to explain the life of this great figure and a book that's been recently published. And we're going to get to that. Stay tuned. So we have here Mr. Jules Samuels, and thank you for coming on today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
And why don't you give us a little background about how you came to be promoting a book, and maybe tell us a bit about the book about Savonarola before we get into his life.
Well, I founded the Savonarola Society back in 2020, so I'd have been about 19 at the time, as a devotional society, sort of to promote his canonization. Um, and it's sort of grown from there. And last year, my colleague Alex Norton um, came to me with the suggestion of launching this big project called the Savonarola Project, or the Opera Savonarola, as the fancy name is now. And the intention is rather to translate all of Savonarola's works into English for the first time, because that's never been done before. There's been bits and pieces here and there, some letters here, some sermons there, but never everything. And the problem with sort of trying to promote a cause of canonization is if the only copies of a text are from the Victorian era and they're in these old dusty collections, it's not going to work. It's not going to, it's not going to cut it. Um, and so that's how and I pitched sort of the idea of expanding it beyond just the text of Savonarola. So we're working on those. We're translating them. Alex, lovely man, brilliant man. He's the translator, the website developer, graphic designer. He does all the art. He's very, very talented. Um, so we published this first volume, well, rather republished. Yeah, as you can see there, Jerome Savonarola, a sketch. Um, it was written by an American Dominican, actually, Father James O'Neill, who was from California, uh, lived there all his life. And he planned to write a trilogy of these books. So the first one we've republished. The second one, we've sent the manuscript over to Aruka Press for, which is was Savonarola really excommunicated? And it's a look at the issues in canon law that we'll get into later on in this stream. Unfortunately, he died before he could write the third one, so which was supposed to be was Savonarola a prophet, which would have been nice to have, but it's not really necessary. And so yeah, the goal is to publish some of these secondary sources that are either out of print or have never been translated into English, from Italian or French. I'm working on a French translation of one of his biographies by Fra Bayonne. It's very, very detailed. It's 1,000 pages long. He goes through all these documents that have been rediscovered in the 19th century. So it's coming along. I don't know if you actually saw, we got a letter from, we wrote to Pope Francis and he replied to us way back in, well, November now. And the Italian press, the Italian post service being what it is, it took a while to get back. But I've got the letter downstairs from Pope Francis. So it's growing, and praise be to God, it's hopefully going to achieve its end of promoting devotion to Savonarola and eventually seeing him canonized one day, God willing.
That's amazing. And so I'll give you my understanding of Savonarola, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong, and then we can fill in the blanks. So he is Italian, of course, and Girolamo is Jerome. We'll call him Jerome because it's easier to say than Girolamo. And he becomes eventually a Dominican priest. And has a very high academic capacity. He's obviously very intelligent, and he's a major figure in the San Marco monastery in Florence. And eventually, this is at the beginning of the Renaissance kind of revolution, let's call it, or Renaissance movement. And Florence is not known for being the most pious city at the time, nor is it today. And I actually used to live in Lucca, which was a half an hour west of Florence. So I spent a lot of time in Florence growing up. And always been known as a place of high society, which is good and bad. Good when it's good and really bad when it's bad. And this was a period where things started getting kind of bad. So he became sort of this force for traditional morals, Catholic piety, rejecting the spirit of the age, and became very famous within the city of Florence. It's a time of great corruption in the papacy, moral corruption especially, as well as some financial stuff and whatnot. Not the brightest era. It was preceding the Reformation, so those areas weren't that era wasn't the best. Hence why there was a reaction. And eventually he dies on the wrong side of things, legally speaking. However, after his death, their continued devotion to him, people disputed the reality of his canon or his excommunication and so forth. And for many, especially in the Dominican order and even many popes, he's seen as a saint. So is that a decent overview of his life?
That's a pretty decent summary, yes. In terms of the details, you're pretty much spot on. I mean, a lot of it is still disputed over by historians and theologians, especially as you get later on into the nitty gritty of what he's actually condemned for. Because you'll have some writers, Ludwig Pastor calls him says it's for disobedience and for false prophecy, but what we have actually in the bull is uniquely the issue of disobedience, which we can get onto, because it really is sort of butt kiss, as it were. It's the excommunication probably, well, no, definitely wasn't valid, and I don't think personally that even Pope Alexander thought it was valid, because he had a tendency to sort of go backwards and forwards on the issue of Savonarola, and that's something that you find throughout the whole thing. It's that it's very inconsistent. You get one document from the Pope comes out, and then Savonarola protests it, and the Pope withdraws it, only to then reissue it to someone else. That happened, for example, with the first ban on preaching in 1496. He he ref, sorry takes permission away from Savonarola to preach, and then he gives it back, only to then withdraw it again in a letter which is sent not to Savonarola, not to the Dominicans, but in fact to the Franciscan convent, which talks about a certain friar Girolamo, who is supposedly the head of the congregation of San Marco, and it imposes all these restrictions on him for the same things that the Pope had withdrawn the restrictions in the first place, for the exact same reasons. And so again, he brings it to Alexander, and Alexander withdraws it again. And there's about a 2-year period where the Pope doesn't want anything to do with him. It's reported by some of the biographers, including Zovio, Polish Catholic Church historian, that Alexander supposedly said, "Tell me nothing of that man, for good or ill. The man may be a saint for all I know." So it's when going through this, one has to be careful, because it's actually very subtle, and not not in a necessarily a good sense, because everybody just sort of went back and forth on it.
I well, everyone who watches my show knows my stance on Archbishop Lefebvre, and they're not the same story. They're in different positions, but in a sense, analogous kind of settings, in the sense of upheaval, morals gone wrong, bad practices. bad management, let's call it. And Malachi Martin, the famous or infamous, depending on who you're asking. I thought he was quite an interesting character. A friend of mine's writing a biography on him, Rob Morrow. And Malachi Martin had a famous quote that I think would apply to Savonarola, but it was about Lefebvre. And he said, he's like a chicken bone caught in their throat. They can't swallow him and they can't cough him up. And there's something about Savonarola where you look at it and you go, they didn't really know what to do with him because he was right about basically everything. And then there was pressure from those who disliked him and so forth. And it was kind of this waffling. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I agree. I think obviously there is some danger in conflating the two cases. I mean, they are
They're very different in many ways.
fundamentally
Yeah.
different in that there was far less communication between Savonarola and the court in Rome, but there are similarities. There were internal enemies within the church, whispering in the ear of the Pope with Savonarola, um, friars who had been exiled for their scandalous preachings, members of the Medici court, which had set up at Rome under Piero the Unfortunate, who'd been expelled from the city to before the Republic was restored in 1495. So I think there are similarities, and I mean, on that subject of being swallowed down, they did try. Alexander sent quite famously in a quite famous episode the offer of a cardinal's hat if he would stop preaching about certain issues, and he prayed about it for a day, and his answer was made in the pulpit when he announced, I will wear no hat except for mine own reddened in my blood given up for Christ." uh, so when the carrot didn't work, they sort of went to the stick, as it were.
So he eventually there was this specious, let's call it, excommunication. But then he was executed, correct? And that was by the civil authority. Was that how it worked?
Well, yes. Pope Alexander essentially left the city with no choice because he threatened to put them under interdict, and the friars' opponents had sort of won all the seats in the signoria either through unjust means, whether it was, for example, when they arrested Savonarola, the enemy partisans, who were nicknamed the Arrabbiati,
The
the
angry ones.
Ragers.
Yeah.
Yes, um, murdered a whole number of his followers in the streets. Murdered, I think, at least 5 or 6 important nobles right then and there to sort of prevent him from getting any support within the city itself. Uh, and he was taken, he was tortured for about a month and a half, to the point where he couldn't even sign his own name anymore. And they tortured a confession out of him in which he essentially said, all my visions are false, all my prophecies are nonsense, I lied, etc., etc. And then with great repentance, he recounts for his recantation, and he goes to his death very penitent on the 23rd of May, 1498, for ever having recanted it. And his last words are with a recitation of the Apostles' Creed as he was hanged and then burned. Um,
I'm reminded of, in a way, the story of Joan of Arc. There is some dispute on how she recanted, but nonetheless, whatever the controversy was, it was great duress and great pressure, and very inhuman conditions. And then immediately after that, becomes heartbroken at what's happened, and then sort of goes back to business as usual. And then obviously we know she was burned at the stake. And when you said that he was too injured to sign a document, I was reminded of St. Edmund Campion, who, when the Anglicans were trying to debate him and have him swear an oath or put his hand on his heart or whatever it was, he's like, I can't lift my arm because they'd pulled him and stretched him too much. And so he was treated very poorly. And so there's these people being murdered. This is something that is very strange for us moderns, that there would be a murder in the street about a preacher. So what was that all about? Why were some people so pro Savonarola and some were so against him? What was the background there?
Well, we'll have to talk just a little bit about the culture of Florence before Savonarola. So, throughout much of the 15th century, the power of the Medici family had been growing. First under Cosimo the Elder, and then under Cosimo the Younger, and of course under Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. The Florentine culture had been building its reputation as a banking city, had been growing. It was funding much of the Italian peninsula. It was funding the papacy, uh, and with that level of material prosperity, there came a sort of revival of paganism, essentially. Um, Pagan morals, certainly. Florence, already for about a century before this, had become the city of the sodomites, as it were. And Saint Bernardine of Siena, quite famously came to Florence many times to preach specifically against sodomy. He at the beginning of the same century, 1425, I think is when he dies. Um, but that sort of material culture at the very end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance, with the literature of Petrarch and Dante, and it's very it's quite beautiful. This material culture, it produces great works of art. It produces Botticelli, who's a contemporary and disciple of Savonarola, actually. Um, but with it went this dismissive attitude for the Middle Ages, for scholasticism, for Catholic theology. This is one of the things Savonarola complained about in his sermons, that people much preferred to go to sermons for their rhetorical impact, as it were, rather than to hear anything special about the faith or about the saints. People would go from sermon to sermon to hear someone preach, using to see who was the most rhetorical of preachers, who was using Aristotle, who's referencing Cicero this week, and the scriptures would never get a look in. Essentially, uh, was his complaint, and so he often only preached on the scriptures. Certainly, the cycle of his sermons is on Exodus, on Haggai, on Zechariah. There's very few sermons on just a topic. He did his sermons in a cycle, and it's quite useful for printing them out. But
Mm.
and so this material culture, this intellectual culture, it's very pagan. Famously, Pico della Mirandola, who was in his later years a disciple of Savonarola, and so was his nephew, the other Giovanni Count Pico della Mirandola. But Pico is an exact example of this. He writes his 95 theses, and he sends them out, and I think about 60 of them are condemned straight away, because they're theses like, natural religion, Adamic religion is lost. All these different religions, Mohammedanism, paganism, whatever, they're attempting to get to the one true religion. The Greeks got to it best. It was another one of his theses. So it's very it's very pagan. In fact, Pius XII in L'Osservatore in one of his articles in L'Osservatore Romano, wrote of Savonarola. He said, Savonarola shows us the strong conscience of the ascetic, and an apostle who has a lively sense of things divine and eternal, who takes a stand against rampant paganism, who remains faithful to the evangelical and Pauline ideal of integral Christianity, put into action in public life as well, and animating all institutions. This is why he started preaching, prompted by an interior voice and inspired by God.
That's Pope Pius XII. That would have
That
been
is
in
what
the
Pius
30s or 40s or 40s or 50s whenever he wrote
50s.
that. So we're talking 450 years or so after the excommunication and death. So that's kind of a big endorsement. And it's funny you're mentioning the milieu that he's in. at the time, and I was reading from the late great Michael Davies, who I have so much affection for, and he wrote in his article that an article that he penned in the '90s about Savonarola that you can find a reprint at the Remnant, and he said he quotes or he relays this story or paraphrases Saint John Fischer, obviously heroic English bishop, along with Thomas More, one of the great martyrs of England, and he says Fisher said that things were so bad in the papal court and in the sort of milieu of the governance of the church that if they didn't reform it, God would reform it for him, for
Mm.
them. And it seems like the saintly men of the time understood the scope. And as you mentioned, the revival of paganism and sort of this nod to naturalist religion and so forth. I mean, it in many ways sounds kind of like a crisis that we've been going through in the last half century. And in some ways, we're still kind of waiting for a Savonarola character to rise up. People could say certain of them have been so, but it seems like the era that we're living in right now, in a sense. Was that a fair comparison, or?
Oh no, absolutely. You're not the first to make that observation. In fact, it's reported in at least one source that Pope Pius X once said, "If I had an army of 100 Savonarolas, the reform of the church would be over by now."
Well, he was very industrious. We spent about a half an hour in his cell at San Marco in Florence last November when my wife and I were on a pilgrimage, and the guide, to her credit, she was a very professional lady, and she didn't take a side either way. She just sort of explained like what he did and how much he did, and some loved him and some didn't. She was very objective about it, which I appreciated, and just the amount of things that he did. I don't know when he slept. The amount of work that he put in. He was extremely conscientious. One of the things he's known for, though, was the Bonfire of the Vanities. What's that all about for the listeners?
Well, people have this very, whether it's romantic or I suppose horrified imagining of the friar sending out all these gangs of street thugs to collect works of art, irretrievable paintings from Botticelli, and piling them high and burning them because they're vanities. And the truth is that these bonfires of vanities, they weren't new. St. Bernardine had done the same thing up and down Italy in the 1420s, including in Florence. And the things that were destroyed were not particularly valuable. Uh, they were mirrors, fans, jewelry, boxes of ladies' makeup, that sort of thing. So it is true that Botticelli, in because he was a great disciple of Savonarola, did burn some of his sketches, but I don't think anything of great value was lost. He didn't ransack some of his already done paintings. He didn't burn anything of that sort. And in fact, a great deal of his art was inspired by Savonarola's preaching. I don't know if you've ever seen his Mystic Nativity.
Is it in the
Uh,
monastery? Is it in the convent?
no, it's actually in London in the National Gallery. But it's quite a famous painting, the Mystic Nativity of Botticelli, and it was directly inspired by Savonarola's Christmas Eve sermon of 1496, I think. Um, and it's quite a famous piece. And so this idea that it was the destruction of culture and blah 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 blah, the things that people bring up, it's yeah, that's it.
Okay. And that was inspired. That I've seen this before. I didn't know what the name was, and this was inspired by his preaching.
Yes, directly. Because there were a great deal of artists who were Savonarola's disciples, including Michelangelo. Uh, he may not entirely have agreed with Savonarola's, who would have been very in favor of the fig leaf campaign. He may not entirely have agreed with him on that, but in terms of the principles, we know from Vasari, who did the biographies of these artists. I think he's called the Lives of Famous Painters by Giorgio Vasari. He talks about Michelangelo's love and devotion to Savonarola from his time in Florence. Because a great deal of the Florentines had a sincere love for Fra Girolamo for, well, up until modern times, really, and even still today, they still quite love him. Most of them, I mean, the ones who are communists or whatever, they might view him as sort of the devil incarnate, but
Well, you know what? Hey, there are some things I've written that I would probably like to burn if I had the chance. You know, I mean, Botticelli obviously is a human being going through a growth as a Catholic, like we all do, and I'm sure that he put pen to paper with things that he, was not happy to have done, and wanted to burn those. There's nothing wrong with that. And also, I will say this, a priest friend of mine, Father Sherry, he he's actually in London now, Father David Sherry at the St. George's House, and he's very relatable when he preached, and he said, I'll tell you guys something, and don't take this the wrong way, but often saints are very weird. And what he meant by that is, he says, you look at some of the ascetical practices and so forth, and he says, if these are not inspired by God, these are just strange nervous problems, and we look often at saints and we think that's strange. But I think they look at us and they go, why are you living like that? That's strange. And, you look at like St. Anthony of the Desert, I think, and by the end of his life, he's basically telling everyone like never shower again and stop eating food and just go out and like, basically he took the asceticism so far that to us it sounds extreme, but to him, I mean, he had renounced the world. He had he had gotten as close to the beatific vision on earth as any man can get, and he was fully detached. And so when you see these great saintly men, sometimes you find this in Liguori. There are some opinions that Liguori has that some vehemently disagree with, and some think that he was onto something. And when it's in the realm of disputed questions, there's really no harm or foul there. So I think on the whole, this isn't an issue.
no, no. People, opponents of Fra Girolamo, tend to find whatever they think will stick, because it's quite a useful narrative. He's been framed in countless ways. Until very recently, Protestants have been claiming him as an early Protestant. Italian Marxists have been claiming him as an early revolutionary. Uh, Conservatives have been proclaiming him one thing or another, and traditionalists have been claiming him the proto Marcel Lefebvre. And i- at some point, you have to recognize that he's not really proto anything. He's
He's
his
just
own
who he
man.
is. He's just who he
Yeah,
is.
in his own time, trying to work out his salvation, as we all are. Uh, but I think he's a very powerful symbol in that sense, and people want to have him in their corner, as it were, which is a fine instinct to have, but it goes a bit far sometimes.
Well, that sort of thing happens with a lot of great saints. I used to work in the Catholic education system here in Ontario, and it's not a very good system, sadly, hence why I'm no longer there. But funny enough, so in our it's a public system that calls itself Catholic, so it uses the same calendar as the public schools and so forth. So there's like Earth Week every year, which basically is just like climate propaganda week. And I used to do the prayers on the announcements, which are to their dismay. And it was Earth Week, and they said, I want you to read, we basically, they wanted to co-opt St. Francis as the environmentalist saint, as everyone likes to do, because he loved birds and fishes, so he must have, hated fossil fuels. And whatever. And so they said, we want you to read the Canticle of the Sun. And I said, great, I'll read that. Because they gave me the paper. They'd never read it. And I knew they hadn't read it because the last paragraph of it is very fire and brimstony. And probably not supposed to be smiling when you say things like this, but I'm reading through the whole thing happily, in front of the school on the announcements. And at the end, it was like, and woe to those who die in mortal sin, because something like, their fate is eternal hellfire or something like that. And again, I was smiling from ear to ear, not because I'm happy about people going to hell, but I couldn't help but laughing at the irony of all these environmentalist Marxists wanting to co-opt St. Francis. and they never actually read they just copy and pasted, and now I'm basically telling the whole student body to confess all their sins or they're going to hell. And they were so horrified at what was said, they couldn't get mad at me. Point being, though, saints are always co-opted by different groups because saints are close to perfect, and because of that, they have balanced temperaments. They have a strong sense of prudence and a strong sense of justice and a strong sense of temperance, and so on and so forth. So there are many characteristics about them that are sort of fractioned political movements. They latch onto those things, but this is not a mark against the saint. The fact that the Marxists can latch on is probably because he was right about his condemnation of luxury and so forth. The fact that the traditionalists can latch on is because he was so strong on doctrine and so on and so forth. But really, that's what a saint is. They're always co-opted by everyone.
No, that's exactly right. And it should go to say that he did inspire saints in public office. Blessed Giorgio La Pira, who was the mayor of Florence in the last century, early part of the last century, was an avid devotee of Savonarola. And there are plenty of other figures who were, plenty of other saints who were directly inspired by him. So sanctity is attractive, and that's the truth at the end of the day. Even controversial sanctity which ends up getting you burned alive, it is attractive. It's an attractive quality to have, and certainly that's what drew people to him in his life. uh, when he took over San Marco and he divorced it from the Lombard congregations, um, the number of novices exploded. He had, I think, well over 100, all, and he was only there for the for 8 years at the end until his death. I mean, 100 novices. I think they founded a second foundation to house them all in the span of 8 years. That's a clear sign that there was something appealing to it. But at the same time, it was humble. There was a real sense of humility behind it. Um, he writes in some of his letters to some of these novices that we still have, he urges them to be patient, to be charitable with their brethren. There's one letter which I'm a great fan of, which is he's writing a letter to a newly professed friar who is holier than most of the people in the congregation, and he recognizes this. He tells him, I recognize these virtues in you. You know, you are more advanced than even some of the elders in the congregation. But that's a reason you need to be more patient. You need to become accommodating to them, because in spite of your status, you're holier than them. But that means you need to exercise more patience with them because they're still your superiors, they're still your brothers, etc., etc. So he was a very practical man in that sense. He got down to the reality of things. He didn't say, "Oh no, you shouldn't think of yourself as this or that." He didn't deny reality to sort of fit everything into a box. He dealt with it as it came, and he just got on with it. And that is, I think, one of his most attractive qualities.
Who are some of the great saints who have had a great devotion to him? I believe Saint Philip Neri is one. And who are some others?
Well, there's a whole list. St. Philip Neri is the big one. St. Philip Neri is the one we have the most documentation for. It's in all his early biographers. He kept a picture of Savonarola in his private chapel, which he had painted a halo around. He wrote a little verse underneath it, "Hail to thee, our excellent teacher, founder of our morals," blah 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 blah. When he died, in fact, the only books that he had were his breviary, and a sort of collected works of Savonarola. Those were his private books. Um, and he had some miracles associated with Savonarola, actually. Um, the big one is it's recorded in all the biographies, although some of the earlier biographies delete some elements of it, because he was still quite a controversial figure. But when he was at Santa Sopra Minerva with the Dominicans, there was a consistory that the Jesuits had brought, had tried to get the works of Savonarola condemned as heretical. And this was under, I think, Pope Sixtus. And anybody who knows anything about Pope Sixtus knows that he was inclined to find heresy where there was none. He saw heretics jumping out of the corner at him. I mean, he even imprisoned Cardinal Poole, the Reginald Poole, the Archbishop of Canterbury, very famously exiled from England for his opposition to Henry VIII. His mother, Blessed Margaret Poole, killed on his orders. So not a man who was ever going to be a heretic. But you still had him arrested on suspicion of it. And the Jesuits had said, "Oh, this is heretical." And at some point, Sixtus is supposed to have said, "Well, this is Martin Luther," as some of these works were read out to him. But St. Philip Neri was praying, and before the Blessed Sacrament, and all of a sudden, he collapses on the floor, and he starts shouting, "Victoria, Victoria, victory!" And the Dominicans sort of rush over, and they lie him down, and he says, "Joyful news! At the very moment I was before the Blessed Sacrament, I heard our Lord saying, 'The cause is won. Savonarola is vindicated.'" And it was at the exact moment that he sort of collapsed in his ecstasy that they later found out. At that exact moment that the consistory pronounced against condemning Savonarola. And so St. Philip, so like I said, St. Philip Neri, the big one. There are plenty of others. St. Catherine de' Ricci, who founded the convent in Prato, she was healed actually directly by Savonarola. She had a vision of him in heaven, and he reached down and touched her because she had this chronic condition which inflamed her so badly she couldn't even walk, and so she was sort of crawling on the floor. And he touched her, and it went away for the rest of her life. This condition. Um,
Sorry, we had to pause there for my son coming in. You were saying about St. Catherine de' Ricci.
yes, she kept some of his relics in the convent, which I believe are still there. And obviously, he'd been burned to specifically prevent people from taking relics. Uh, and people in sort of a demonic frenzy had been throwing stones at his corpse to get it to collapse faster. But some of these body parts were rescued, so some of his fingers, bits and pieces, and she kept it in a reliquary in the convent there, which I believe is still there in Prato, but I'm not entirely sure. But she wrote lots of hymns to Savonarola, canzoni as they were called, um, lots of sacred hymns, and she had at least one vision of him ascending to heaven, as it were, with the two other friars who were executed with him. And so this was actually brought up at her during her canonization process. Uh, well, she can't have been holy. She had such a strong devotion to Savonarola, and Benedict XIV, who was the Pope at the time, sort of quashed it and said, "Oh,
You're still there.
sort
Don't
of
worry.
quashed." Yes, sorry. He sort of quashed it and said it's irrelevant to the matter. And in fact, if you read some of these lives of the saints, collected versions of the lives of the saints, including the big one, the Bollandist Acta Sanctorum, he's got an entry in there on May 23rd.
Well, that's it just goes to show that well, what is the line from Shakespeare? There are more things on heaven and earth than there are in your philosophies. Sometimes the actions of hierarchs, including the Pope, when it's not a matter of faith and morals, can, not always be on point, and great pressures can affect those things, and the codes of canon law and whatnot are obviously extremely useful, and we should never be willy-nilly with those things. But we look to the code, and it says the highest law is the salvation of souls. It's the point of the code of law. And here seems to be a man that was animated by that above all things in a tumultuous time. And, as is to be expected. He fell down on the wrong side of a corrupt environment, and this should be something that is a justification for his sanctity, not something against it.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, many popes, if not most popes who have dealt on this issue, have been sort of inclined to his sanctity. Um, Julius II, so Alexander VI's immediate successor, ordered Raphael to paint him into the I'm sure you've been into the Raphael rooms in the Vatican, just off the Sixtine Chapel, in the Disputation on the Blessed Sacrament, which is just opposite the School of Athens. Savonarola is actually painted in there on the request of Pope Julius II. This is less than 20 years after his condemnation, his execution on at the hands of one pope. Another pope is putting him in the same painting with St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, Our Lord, Our Lady, St. John the Baptist. And plenty of popes since then have been very favorable to him. Leo X, who was himself, in fact, a Medici, the brother of Piero, who was also exiled from the city when the change back to a republic took over in 1495. A man who would have every reason to hate Savonarola, in fact, gave a plenary indulgence to all pilgrims who visited his cell in the convent of San Marco. And we have records of this. And all these different popes across history, Clement VIII famously said that he would like to canonize him, and he permitted him to be venerated under the titles of doctor and martyr and virgin, and etc., etc. Down to modern popes, Pius XI. Um, in Going back to St. Joan of Arc, it's recorded in at least one source that he was visiting a Roman church which had a triptych on display of St. Lawrence, St. Joan of Arc, and Savonarola. And the person who was with him, I can't remember whom, said, "Well, isn't it a terrible shame that Savonarola's not got a halo?" And Pope Pius the 11th is supposed to have turned to him and said, "One day, one day." And Pius the 12th loved him greatly. Even Pope Francis had some good things to say about him recently. Uh,
That's quite
so,
that's quite an array of different popes there.
mm, and it just goes to show that the it is a difficult one, because obviously one pope condemned him, and then a whole bunch of popes want to recover him. So it's an interesting one, and I'm sure as if we get there, God willing, in the process of canonization, it'll be back and forth on these issues. But you can really see that he inspired a great deal of saints. We've even got another one who's going to be canonized this year.
Frassati.
Pier Giorgio Frassati, yeah, took the name Girolamo when he became a third order member of the Dominicans in honor of Savonarola, and he had lots of his sermons in his room when he died, quite young, in fact.
We'll finish up here, but our chaplain on our pilgrimage was a traditional Dominican, Father Albert Callio, and that was quite fun traveling around all these sites in Italy with a traditional Dominican, because you never see them anymore. So he had he had the haircut, and he had the vest, the old robes and whatnot, like the same type of cassock, and he looked like everybody in the paintings. So people wanted to get their picture with him that even weren't part of our group, because it's like, oh look, you're like the people that are painted up there. The tourists have no idea, but it was like for them it was almost like a Renaissance fair or something. But he was the real deal, and he was saying that it was standard in the Dominican order until the changes after the council and all that. That he was just known as a saint, and all the Dominicans knew it, and it was a normal thing. But so I think the testament of history, I think the specious nature of the time in which he lived with the legal reality, I think the testimony of all these great saints after him, I really think that we can have confidence in asking for his intercession, at least as a way to promote this cause. And so I thank you for presenting this, and I appreciate that you reached out to me. And people don't know the backstory, but I waffled on our scheduling about 5 or 6 times Ugh, terrible at that. So I thank you for your patience in coming on. And is there anything you'd like to tell us, place they can visit or something like that before we sign off here? Ladies and gentlemen, just at that point in the interview, there started to be technical difficulties on my guest's end, and it corrupted the audio, so he wasn't able to tell you where to go. So I've put the links for things related to Jerome Savonarola underneath, and but the whole of the interview was there otherwise. So, all right, God bless you all, and I'll talk to you soon.